Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. New York, a January morning. The air was biting, the sidewalks gleaming with a thin film of frost. Yellow taxis zipped through the streets like nervous bees, and steam rose from the manhole covers in a discreet but typically New York ballet. The hotel, the Kingsbury Grand, majestic and imposing, stood on 59th Street, a stone's throw from Central Park. With its ivory stone columns, large bay windows, and mahogany revolving doors, it had the kind of elegance that only age can transform into myth. Every morning, black Bentleys and Rolls-Royces pulled up to the entrance, pouring out a stream of diplomats, CEOs with expensive watches, renowned artists, and capricious millionaires. Inside, the main hall was a world apart. The marble floor, imported from Italy, reflected the rays of a bohemian crystal chandelier suspended more than 10 meters above the ground. The walls, lined with burgundy velvet, seemed to muffle sounds to preserve a cozy atmosphere. The scent of a subtle blend of wood wax and cedarwood room fragrance wafted through the air. And yet, in this theater of luxury and excess, a man moved silently, almost like an elegant ghost. Walter Harris, night concierge for over 15 years. He was well into his 50s, with a straight but discreet figure, graying temples, and thin glasses that he mechanically cleaned at the slightest moment of respite. His rare voice was soft, measured, almost musical. He was called Mr. Harris, or simply the concierge, but no one would have been able to say where he lived or what he did outside of his midnight blue uniform. He always arrived a little early, changed his shoes into a pair that was impeccably polished, and then settled into his post near the central counter. He never talked about himself, didn't participate in staff gossip, and always excused himself before leaving, even briefly. Some young employees saw him as a living decoration of the hotel, a kind of human piece of furniture that people forget to look at. Others respected him silently, impressed by his absolute calm, his way of placing a reassuring hand on the shoulder of a worried guest, or of finding a taxi in a few seconds in the middle of a snowstorm. Walter never complained. He knew every nook and cranny of the hotel, the preferences of the regulars, the names of the chefs at every Michelin-starred restaurant within 5 blocks. He had the memory of those who observe more than they speak. That morning, however, something was going to break the precise routine of the Kingsbury Grand. At 10:23, a black limousine with tinted windows slowly stopped in front of the main entrance. A doorman immediately rushed forward, almost knocking over a bellhop who was arranging fresh flowers in the vases in the lobby. The vehicle door opened with a whoosh, revealing a slender figure. Madison Caldwell, 34, descended without a word. She wore a fitted ivory dress, a camel wool winter jacket, and black sunglasses, though no rays pierced the sky. Her heels clicked on the icy marble with effortless authority. It seemed like she belonged in this universe before she even entered it. Daughter of the legendary hotel magnate Richard Caldwell, she had taken over the management of several establishments after his death. Feared for her quick decisions, admired for her modernity, Madison never announced her visits. When she appeared in a hotel, it was to observe, evaluate, and possibly buy. Or close. At reception, hushed chaos ensued. The manager rushed in, his tie ill-fitting and his smile strained. The staff scrambled. Calls were made to the kitchen, the VIP floor, and security. In less than 2 minutes, Madison had a presidential suite, champagne ordered, and 2 maids assigned exclusively to her comfort. But in this well-oiled choreography of bows and forced smiles, an almost insignificant detail was going to change everything. An phone call, a simple gesture, a forgotten language, and a man that no one was looking at anymore would, in a few seconds, become again the center of a world he had fled for too long. While Madison Caldwell waiting for the elevator in the opulent hotel lobby, she absent-mindedly scrolled through notifications on her high-tech phone. With a slight flick of her hand, she swiped a message away, but the phone suddenly slipped from her gloved fingers, ricocheted off the polished marble, and disappeared beneath an antique mahogany chest of drawers set between 2 columns. Ugh, she huffed, annoyed. A young bellhop passing by stopped, hesitated for a moment, but did nothing. too nervous to disturb the object or risk scratching a piece of antique furniture likely worth more than his annual salary. The other staff members subtly looked away. The scene lasted barely a few seconds, but in this world where appearances were everything, hesitation was tantamount to offense. And then, almost as if he stepped out of the shadows, Walter Harris approached calmly. Without a word, he knelt down, placed one hand on the floor for balance, and with unexpected agility, slid his arm under the piece of furniture. In an instant, he pulled out the iPhone, untouched. He held it out with a courteous smile, without insistence, without servility. "Here you go, ma'am." Madison, who hadn't even noticed him until then, picked up the phone, a little surprised by the fluidity of his gesture. She answered automatically, "Thanks." But the moment she looked at the screen, her gaze changed. The settings had accidentally opened, and the entire interface was displaying technical terms in German. She frowned, looking up at Walter. "You speak German?" she asked, one eyebrow raised, almost incredulous. He nodded slowly, then replied in clear, perfectly dictionable German, with that intellectual accent that one only finds after years of immersion. "Yes, I taught in Munich and Leipzig years ago." "Yes, I taught in Munich and Leipzig years ago." Madison looked at him more closely. This wasn't just a perfectly uniformed concierge standing before her anymore. There was something deeper in his posture, in the precision of his phrasing, something she wasn't used to seeing in those who moved silently through the hotel's backrooms. "You were a teacher?" she asked, this time in French, automatically. Walter lowered his eyes slightly. A fragile silence fell. His fingers tightened for a moment on the tablet he held against his hip. Then he looked up. There was neither pride nor shame in his voice. Just a quiet, rare, naked honesty. "Professor of German literature. Before life took me elsewhere." That was all. A short sentence, like a half-open door onto a heavy past, erased but not forgotten. Madison, however, remained frozen. She could have answered, questioned, filled the silence like people accustomed to being in control of situations. But for some reason she didn't yet understand. She didn't. There was in this man's gaze, in his discreet wrinkles, in the way he held his back straight despite the humility of his position, a form of dignity that could not be bought. Something broken, yes, but still standing. Walter, for his part, bowed slightly and continued on his way to the concierge's office, as if nothing had happened. More this brief moment, almost invisible to anyone else in the hall, had just opened a question in Madison's mind that would never leave her. Who is this man really, and why is he hiding in the shadows? That was all. But that was enough. That night, Madison didn't sleep. Back in her suite, overlooking the icy lights of Central Park, she sat at her desk, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, unable to banish the image of Walter from her mind. There was something inconsolable in his eyes, a mixture of calm and self-effacement, like a man who had closed the doors to his own history, until a word in German accidentally opened them. She opened her laptop, typed Walter Harris plus teacher plus Munich Leipzig plus Columbia University. And there, it was like discovering a past buried under the dust of silence. Dr. Walter J. Harris, Professor Emeritus at Columbia University until 2006. Author of several notable essays on German Romantic thought, notably on Novalis, Schlegel, and Goethe. Reference translator of Elective Affinities, critically acclaimed for having been able to restore the poetic sensitivity of the text with an almost mathematical rigor. He had given lectures in Vienna, Heidelberg, and Oxford. A photo pops up on an old university website. Walter, with a fuller beard, slightly different glasses, but the same deep gaze. He's holding an open book, explaining something to an attentive audience. The title of the lecture, Language as a Bridge Between Solitude and Transcendence. But then nothing. Articles abruptly stopped around 2007. Alumni forums discussed his sudden disappearance. One wrote, "He taught us so much. After his divorce, he changed. And when his son died in that accident, he collapsed. It was unbearable to see. A broken genius." Madison felt her throat tighten. This discreet man who cleaned floors before dawn, had crossed darknesses she could only imagine. Losing a child, leaving your job, disappearing from the world, surviving in silence. She sat for a long time, her eyes fixed on the screen, her heart heavy. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was compassion, and genuine admiration. Walter hadn't simply failed. He had retired with an almost monastic dignity, and no one, in 15 years, had turned around to look for him. The next morning, Madison went down to the lobby earlier than usual. She calmly asked to see Walter. He arrived a few moments later, surprised, the sleeves of his uniform neatly folded, a little suspicious. He wasn't used to being asked for anything other than a tap problem or lost luggage. "You wanted to see me, madam?" Madison invited him to sit in a small private lounge near the cozy bar. She placed her phone face down on the table, crossed her legs, and looked at him, straight ahead. "Why are you here, doing this work, when you have given so much?" Walter was silent for a moment. Time seemed to stand still. Then he answered, in a soft, almost absent voice. "Because books don't heal broken hearts. No pathos, no complaints, just the naked truth, spoken by a man who had loved, lost, suffered, and kept walking, alone." Madison nodded respectfully. She wasn't there to offer him pity, only a possibility. "But your voice can still light up other lives, Walter. You have transmitted, inspired, built bridges between cultures. You can still do it. I run a chain of hotels around the world. What you are, what you know, I would like my employees to have access to it." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "A position as a cultural consultant and language trainer. You could train our staff in the elegance of language, in intercultural finesse, and in dignity in service." Walter remained silent. He hadn't heard such words in years. It seemed unreal. Him, seen again. Him, recognized. He hesitated for a long time. Then, one March morning, as the snow was finally melting on the sidewalks of Manhattan, Walter Harris joins Caldwell Global Resorts headquarters, dressed in a crisp white shirt, a midnight blue blazer, and a shy glint in his eyes. It was a slow comeback, but a comeback. At first, he spoke little. Then, little by little, he regained the confidence of a teacher. He led seminars for executives, spoke about Goethe, about language as a mirror of the soul, and about respect as the foundation of hospitality. He trained receptionists in Germany, Japan, Dubai, and Brazil. He taught young employees how to greet, listen, and welcome with sincerity. He showed them Thatservace not to submit, Butracy the other. Videos of his training sessions circulated online. His perfect diction, his gentle yet profound gaze, and his wise words touched thousands of people. Former students recognized him. Some clients, moved, wrote to him. His story went viral. One day, after a conference in Geneva, a young receptionist approached him, his eyes shining. "Mr. Harris, you made me want to learn German, and to believe that I can become more than what is expected of me." Walter smiled. It was a full, calm smile, without sadness. He hadn't erased his wounds, but he had started again to leave. And above all, Toto transmit. 6 months later, on a mild September evening, the golden leaves of Morningside Heights floated in the air like a living metaphor for change. The campus of Columbia University, majestic, breathed intelligence and history. It was there that Madison Caldwell, in a gesture as discreet as it was powerful, had decided to organize an event entitled Language, Memory, and Rebirth, Conversations with Walter Harris. The room Rotunda Hall, usually reserved for prestigious conferences, was exceptionally full. Students, professors, researchers, journalists, and even a few former colleagues were present. The atmosphere was charged with a curious tension. Some remembered Professor Harris as a fleeting genius. Others had only recently heard of him through viral videos and articles circulating under titles like The Erudite Concierge or The Return of the Forgotten Professor. Walter Harris, dressed in a sober and elegant suit, waited behind the curtain, out of breath. His hands were shaking slightly. It had been more than 15 years that he hadn't stepped onto a university stage. The ghosts of his final years at Columbia hovered in the walls. He remembered the office he had silently emptied, the resignation letter he had left without a goodbye note, his departure into the night, as if he wanted to erase every trace of him. And yet, tonight, he was there. A thunder of applause burst out as he stepped onto the stage. The warm light illuminated him. He put down his notes, took a deep breath, then looked up at the audience. His voice, hesitant at first, recovered in a few seconds the serious depth and the quiet clarity who once held entire rooms hanging on their every word. "I am deeply honored to be here. I thought I would never set foot on this soil again. But sometimes, life, in its mysterious wisdom, offers us a second chapter. He paused. The silence in the room was absolute. I am living proof that it's never too late to become yourself again. That identity is not lost. Sometimes it sleeps, it hides in silence, in pain, in the shadow of what we have lost. But it waits. It hopes. It watches for the moment to be awakened, sometimes by a word, by a look, by a gesture of kindness. He briefly recounted his journey, without pathos, but with overwhelming authenticity. The conferences, the translations, his son's tragedy, the collapse, the silence, the night shifts in the anonymous corridors of a luxury hotel. And then that strange, almost accidental moment when a forgotten language brought him back to himself. For a long time, I believed that my usefulness was behind me. But what I understood is that transmitting something isn't tied to a position or a chair. It's a living act of breath. And every life has the power to transmit something, even in the shadows. When he finished, the room remained silent for a few seconds. Then a standing ovation burst out. Some wiped away tears. Others stood motionless, as if what they had just heard had changed something fundamental within them. Among the guests, in a discreet corner, a young man was waiting nervously. When he was able to approach, he was holding in his hands an old brown leather edition of a collection of German poetry. The Romantic Soul, annotated with fine comments in black ink, recognizable to connoisseurs. Notes by Walter Harris. Mr. Harris? He asked timidly, his voice trembling. I am Elias, the nephew of Professor Schreiber, your former colleague in Leipzig. He often spoke to me about you, about your classes, your silences, and your love for novelis. It was thanks to your translations that I began my studies. They accompanied me through my darkest years. They saved me, I believe. Walter looked at him for a long time. Her eyes filled with tears. He took the book in his hands, stroked it gently as one finds a lost friend, then placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. So all of this was not in vain. That evening, Walter Harris did not return home alone. He was now surrounded, recognized, reintegrated into a world he had quietly left. Not as a star or a legend, but as a human being returned from the night. He was no more the invisible concierge who cleaned Persian carpets while others talked. He had become a mentor, a bridge, a living memory, a figure of resilience, humility, and truth. And it all began by a dropped phone, by a foreign language never forgotten, by a silent heart finally heard.